Welcome everybody. We're delighted to see you all here. You found us in this room today. And we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Yolanda Green this morning. We've heard wonderful things, that her students love her, and she's a first-time speaker at the council this morning, and we truly welcome you and thank you for coming. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Yolanda Green.
I want to say good morning and thank you so much for inviting me here. I am so excited to be here this morning and to talk about an area that I'm very, very passionate about, and that is kinship families and relative caregivers. So I want to start by asking you a question. How many of you in the room this morning work with or have worked with in the past relative caregivers or kinship families? That's great. That's good. How many of you may not have worked with relative families or kinship families, but know someone who is raising their relative personally? Okay. So as we can see, this is a topic that's not unusual. It's a topic that is very familiar to a lot of you in this room. And so this morning, I want to talk about kinship family dynamics. And this is not to say that kinship families are different or that they're difficult, but I just wanted to share with you some of the observations that I have gathered through my research with kinship families, as well as the research literature in child welfare and child abuse and other areas that looks at these particular families and the dynamics, okay? So I started off this morning with actually a quote from one of the grandmothers in a study that I conducted, and she said, look, we all work to get along together for the kids' sake. And when she said the we, she's referring to the birth parents, the grandmother, as well as the child. We work together. So let's talk about the families, these kinship families, and what some of their dynamics are. And I want to thank Paul for preparing all your handouts. Let's look at the overview of this morning's presentation. I'm actually multitasking here, so bear with me. The first thing I'd like to do is to discuss the reasons why we're seeing this increased reliance on relative placements. I also want us to spend some time this morning describing the strengths and needs of each member of the Kinship Triad actually. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that particular section. I also want to explain the dynamics that have been seen in the research and the dynamics that these particular families sometimes experience. And I'll explain that for you as well. Lastly, and I think this is what's really critical and most important, I really want to provide some strategies for working with kinship families, as well as a lot of resources. Try to get you a really good resource list. So when you leave here today, if you work with another kinship family, you'll have some information. You'll know who to call, you'll know where to go, you know the book that'll help you. Give you those resources, okay? So I'm going to ask, as we go through this morning's presentation, if you jot down notes and questions, because at the end I'd like to leave some time to answer any of the questions that you may have. And hopefully throughout the presentation I'll be addressing some of those issues that you're concerned with. Let's start off with the types of kinship care. Usually we refer to kinship care in two types or two forms. There are informal families that are providing kinship care. And when we talk about informal kinship care, those are the families that a lot of us work with in the community. They don't have any legal tie to the child. There's no CPS involvement. There's no court system that's providing services for this particular family. There's really no oversight for these kinship families. When you look this up in the literature, you'll find them referred to as private kinship care. They're also referred to as voluntary kinship placements and also as private arrangements, because basically the family members just get together and say, there is a need for someone to care for this particular child. We're going to take care of this child outside of the foster care system, okay? The other type is formal kinship care. And some of you may be familiar with this particular type of kinship care because these are the families that come into the child welfare system oftentimes. Okay? This is the grandmother that is asked to take care of, provide foster care for her grandchild because there may have been an abuse allegation. These are also the families that may go to probate court and petition probate court so that they can have some legal jurisdiction over their grandchild, understanding that it is a temporary situation, but they do want some legal involvement. And basically, we tend to refer to these families as relative foster care placements. We also talk to them in terms of public kinship care. If you hear that phrase, the child is in public kinship care, they're referring to the formalized type of kinship care. And we also hear it referred to as kinship foster care. Of those two types of kinship care, which one do you think most children reside in? The informal types of placements or the formal? Informal. In fact, one of the issues in child welfare research is that we really can't get a great handle on the numbers of children in informal care. We can't find where these children are in a lot of situations. So we don't have great statistics in terms of the number of children in informal care. What current literature, what one research study found, based on the 2000 census, is that approximately 1.8 million children nationally reside in this type of kinship care placement, in an informal placement. And again, that number is not very accurate, but that gives us some idea. I'm a researcher, so I do enjoy statistics, but I'm not going to give you a lot this morning. Just, you know, that'll kill a crowd, the statistics. But I just wanted to mention one statistic so that you can have an idea, and this is like a bar chart, so that you can see why kinship families are so relevant. This is based on the census data. And basically, it's looking at the number of children per million that have been residing in custodial households where the grandmother is providing for their care. And as you can see, in 1970, it was a relatively small number, about 2.2 million children. However, by the year 2000, that number had doubled, where we were looking at 4.5 million children that were residing in homes where their grandparent was a primary caregiver. So you can see that number really, really did increase. Also, in terms of what's happening locally, there's some very interesting things happening in terms of the statistics. I'm not going to give them all to you, but we know in California, LA County actually has the largest number of custodial grandparents providing care to their grandchildren. And I'll talk a little bit later about what's happening in LA County regarding foster care and custodial grandparents. But again, this kind of gives you the trend, and you can see the increase from 1970 to 2000. So the question comes in, why the increase? What happened that we went from 2.2 million children to 4.5 million children? Do you guys have any ideas of what happened that all of a sudden we began to see so many grandparents raising grandchildren? Yes?
Probably a lot of substance abuse and young girls having children.
Yes, this lady said a lot of substance abuse as well as teen pregnancy and young girls having children. Other reasons? Yes?
Crack cocaine.
Crack cocaine, definitely. It hit around 1980. So again, it goes right back to that, the issue of substance abuse. Other factors.
Both parents working. Both parents working.
Both parents working. Okay, so the fact that parents were working also could have created this increase. Especially what I found in my research study, and that's really intrigued me, is that if parents were working, sometimes they couldn't find jobs locally. And they went out of town. And guess who got to keep the grandchild? Grandma got to keep the grandchild while they were working full time. Okay? So let's look at some of those factors. And I'm only looking at social factors this morning. Definitely increased rates of substance abuse. That was one of the major reasons why we certainly saw that increase. Also, parental illness as well as death. HIV, AIDS, and other illnesses, birth parents with cancer, all of these issues do factor into an increased rate of children residing with grandparents. In the study that I'm working on currently, one of the grandmothers is caring for her granddaughter as a result of the mother's death. And it was a death due to violence, okay? So we want to also factor that in. Parental incarceration. The fact that we have federal sentencing guidelines with substance abuse, we have several women that are incarcerated as a result, again, of drug trafficking and other issues. We saw, as a result of parental incarceration, some of that increase with grandparents providing care. Also, child maltreatment. The fact that so many parents were maltreating their children, and grandparents stepped up to the plate and were willing to care for their children. And over again, that is one of the main issues. In my research study of 361 grandparents in Los Angeles County, that was like the #1 reason why they started to take care of their grandchild. Homelessness is another factor. And also, from a system point of view, the decrease in foster homes. During this time, we also saw a decrease in the rates of traditional foster parents. So as a result, Child Welfare Agency, Child Protective Service Agency said, look, we're losing some of our traditional foster homes. We need to look at what other resources are available for children. And again, as a result, we saw increases of placement with relatives. And there were also some political factors that tied into this as well, or as I like to call them, policy factors. There were some policies that were passed federally that said, look, children belong in the least restrictive, most family-like setting. And those policies were oftentimes interpreted by Child Protective Service agencies as least restrictive, most family-like setting. You must mean a relative. So we need to look for relatives. And as a result of several policies, relative placement became the first choice in situations for out-of-home placement. And now that kind of brings me to another statistic about what's going on in LA County. As you know, I'm pretty sure, the rates of out-of-home placement in Los Angeles County have been decreasing in the past 5 years. Where are most of the children that are in out-of-home placement? Where are they being placed? With relatives. 53%, and I think the actual statistic is 53.1% of the children that are in out-of-home placement in Los Angeles County reside in a relative placement. Okay, so the majority of the children that we see at DCFS and out-of-home placement now are living with a relative. Usually the grandparent, but it may be an aunt, it may be a great aunt, it may be a sibling, but that is what we are now seeing. So that brings us to the question, what are the dynamics that these particular families present? And let's look at the Kinship Triad. Often we want to really focus all of our attention and our services towards the child. What's happening with that child? The child has experienced a loss. Oh, it must be difficult living with a grandparent, et cetera, et cetera. So we usually start with the child. But I want us to remember that kinship families also consist of the relative caregivers and what their needs are. And how for several of these relatives, they weren't expecting to take care of their grandchild and how that impacts them. I had a research meeting with some grandmothers on Tuesday, and they talked about, oh, they love their grandchildren. And then they said, but you know what? At 67, I didn't want my grandchild. That's a big difference, okay? And there's a lot of literature that really focuses on the impact of kinship care on the child. We can find a lot of literature on that. We can also usually find a lot of literature that looks at the impact of kinship care on the relative caregiver in terms of their mental health stability and other factors. But we also don't want to leave out, the birth parent. And a lot of us say, hey, the birth parent isn't there. The birth parent isn't important because, hey, if the birth parent was doing what they were supposed to, we wouldn't have that child in kinship foster care placement or in a voluntary kinship placement. But I don't want you guys to forget that that birth parent still makes an impact on that child's life, on that family's development. And I want us to focus on that kinship triad because they are all connected. Whether or not they're together, living in the same household, whether or not birth parent is involved on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis, there is still a birth parent. And we cannot forget that that person exists and that this is really a triad and not a dyad. So what I want to do is just look at each of the members of the triad and talk about some of the strengths and needs that they have when we're looking at kinship family dynamics. We'll start with the child. As I said often, that's our primary focus. We want to make sure that the child is safe. We want to make sure that the child is in a permanent situation. Our focus usually starts with the child. So what are the strengths? They're resilient. They're able to go into a new placement with a relative. They're able to deal with those issues that brought them to placement. And we know there's a wealth of research that talks about the resilience of children that have been abused and have faced placement. They're also supportive. Any idea of what I mean by supportive? Yes?
Sometimes the child will take on a parental role in support of the adult in those choices.
Exactly. Children often in relative placement support their grandparents. And this is what we find out when we do the research, and it's a very interesting dynamic. They want to help their grandmother. They want to ensure that the placement goes well. So they do take on that supportive role. They're also loyal. And what do I mean by that? Say it.
Loyal to the birth parent?
They're loyal to their birth parents, especially if they're old enough to have some knowledge of their birth parents. And even remembering perhaps not the greatest of living situation with their parent, there is still some parental loyalty. And the grandparents will talk about that. They still want to see their birth parents. Sometimes grandparents can't understand that dynamic, but children oftentimes are loyal and remain loyal to their parents. Other strengths that you have, or that you can think of for these children in kinship care placements. Sure.
Well, I mean, it could be a strength or a challenge, but adaptability because of the changing circumstances that they find themselves in.
Right. So adaptability, and that also kind of goes along with the resilience, the ability to change and to adjust to that grandparent. What the research tells us about that is that children often do better in kinship family placements because there's usually some knowledge of that caregiver, so they're not as fearful about going to that particular person's home, and that would help with that adaptability as opposed to going to a traditional foster family. Other strengths that you guys have noticed. Okay. Let's talk about some of the needs that the children have. The need for safety. Depending on the reason why they're currently residing with that grandparent, there may be a need for safety. If the parent is abusing drugs or is not living a lifestyle that is really conducive for that child to be around that parent, that child needs safety and protection. And that is especially the case with formal kinship placements. With families that are involved in the child welfare system, we understand that they came to the attention of the child welfare system because there's a need for safety. They also need to resolve their loss. And which losses am I referring to? They don't live in that same area, okay? So there are a lot of losses. You were going to mention something as well.
just if the parent died.
Yeah, if the parent died, that's a major loss. But for the situations where the parent is still around, perhaps they're not as involved as they should be, that's still a loss for that child, okay? So they have a lot of losses that they should resolve or need to resolve. They also need information. And this is just so apparent when I talk to the grandparents. It's very interesting. They'll tell you, well, I don't understand why, but my grandchild still wants to know where his biological mom is. They want to know why. They want to know where. So that child needs information. They need to understand how long they're going to be placed with grandmother. And sometimes as social workers or workers in the community, we don't have that information. And we just need to really be honest with the child, with the child's age, making sure that we're developmentally appropriate in terms of telling them, we don't know. But for right now, you're with grandmother. We don't know how long, but grandmother is here to provide care for you. But children, they want information. They love to ask questions, right? They also need their birth parents. They need to have some knowledge of their birth parents, but they also need to have them. There was a very interesting research study conducted in 2006 by Richard Barth, and he looked at foster children across the nation. And he asked them about their parents. And these were older foster children that had been raised in care for several years. And they said the one thing that they always wanted and needed was more visits, more connection to their parents. And that's what they missed. And that was just taken from their own words. So again, they need their birth parents. Peer and community support. If we're placing a child in an area where they're no longer attending the same school, they may lose friends, they may lose whatever community connections. So again, while placement with relatives, we hope, will help to keep those connections. Depending on the logistics, it may not. And we know Los Angeles is a very large county. So in some situations, the grandmother may live in one very different area and that child was raised in another different community. But they need that community support. That's very, very critical. Let's look at the relative caregiver and what their strengths and needs are. I'm going to give you a new term, and it's called WAR. And this term was coined by my colleague, Dr. Eileen Pasteur, over at Cal State University, Long Beach, in her work with custodial grandparents. And she said, WAR kind of sums it up. These grandparents have to be willing, they need to be able, and they need to have the resources to care for the children in their custody. So the W is willingness, the A definitely is the ability, and the R stands for the resources. So is this grandmother willing? I've worked with grandparents that don't want to, do not want to, will not care for their grandchildren for a variety of reasons. So that's part of the assessment. Are you willing to take this on? I've met some grandparents that are very, very willing, but didn't have the ability. Perhaps there were financial problems, perhaps there were severe health problems, perhaps there were even issues of age where they just weren't able to care for a teen or to care for a younger child. I've also met grandparents that just didn't have the resources, and they still chose to care for their grandchild. I've met others that had the resources, that did not have the resources, and chose not to. So again, we're always looking into that family and seeing, hey, what's going on? Is there a war there? And talking to that caregiver about those three issues of willingness, ability, and resources. Whoa, they weren't all supposed to come up at once, but we can I can handle that. Let's look at wise or wisdom. The grandparents also have knowledge and wisdom at this time of their life. They often talk about in the study that I'm currently working on, they'll talk about, well, the mistakes I made with their birth mom, I won't make with my grandchild. I've learned. I'm wise now. I know what I'm doing. So that wisdom is very, very important. And these grandparents use that as a resource to help them care for their grandchildren. They're also very resilient. I mean, it is amazing. They're able to care for their grandchildren and usually understand that this is not a planned event in their lives. They were not at 67 looking forward to caring for their grandchildren. They told me that in no uncertain terms. They wanted to retire and travel and do other things. So the fact that they were able to take in their grandchildren or grandchild and provide for them so shows a level of resilience. And they do it with strength, they do it with humor, they do it with compassion, but there is some resiliency there. They're also committed. They attend the parent meetings at school. Oftentimes the children that are in their homes need multiple services. They provide those services. They have more energy than I do. When I go out and meet with them, I'm amazed. But they're committed to their children and making sure that that child gets the services that they need. So there's a high level of commitment there from the grandmothers that are raising their grandchildren, and we don't want to forget that. On the other hand, they also need resources. There can never be enough. Financial resources, if you are a family that is living in informal kinship here, you may not receive monetary resources. Some of the grandparents talk about the fact that they made the decision to raise their grandchild in an informal arrangement, not knowing that you need sometimes you need the law or some legal documents or some legal help to obtain resources and services for your grandchild. So definitely resources is a need that they have. They also need to resolve the loss. Do you know which loss I'm referring to?
Freedom.
Loss of freedom is one. Because like they told me at the end, that's not what they wanted to do. They loved their grandchildren to death, but they wanted their freedom. What other losses?
Sense of failure that they have, that the children they raise fail.
Exactly. They lost that perfect child. You know, the grandmothers in the study that I'm currently working on, they talk about, boy, I wasn't expecting my grandchild to grow up, to take drugs, and to disappear, and to be homeless. That's not my expectation. You know, as parents, we all want our kids to grow up to be president. At least I want mine to, right? And so you have to look at losing that notion or that idea of the perfect child. And for a lot of the grandparents, that's very, very difficult. They're very angry about that. The fact that their child didn't live up to their expectations to a certain extent has changed their life.
Dr. Green, what about their loss of the role of being a grandparent, like a traditional grandparent?
They've lost their, sorry, you know what, I want to add all your little comments onto my presentation. They've lost that
I know
role.
from my parents, they relish that role as a grandparent, and they just love being able to spoil and not have the consequences. They love that.
I think that's why my mom loves being a grandparent too, because she knows my kids, she's only going to have for a few minutes, they can do whatever, but they're coming back to me. But for these grandmothers, are they grandmother? Are they mom? How can you juggle both? What is the impact on the family? So again, you raise a really good point. They wanted to be a grandmother. They wanted to keep them for a couple hours and send them home, as my mother tells me. But they cannot do that now. Right, yes.
How about guilt? That somehow they failed their children.
Yes, the issue of guilt that has been raised in one of the qualitative research meetings I had, that yeah, they feel really bad that they failed. And that goes really back to that whole notion of the loss of that perfect child. What did I do wrong? It's my fault. You know, and they talk about that often. Yes?
You talked about their wisdom and they're not going to make the same mistakes again, but other studies on grandparents who do then go on to make the same mistakes again? Or?
You know what, that's a great question, and currently, not that I'm aware of, are there studies that really look at that in terms of what happens to what we call the second time around parents. That's what they call themselves. That's from the work of Patricia Gibson over at the University of Minnesota. And I don't think we have anything that's looked at that in terms of, wow, are the mistakes repeated? Good study. Need to get that one funded. Okay. So again, we talked about the need for independence. They did not, at this time in their life, expect to become a mom again. Support from the birth parents is another need that I listed. And I put an asterisk next to it, because this is really situational in terms of the family and the dynamics and what's happening. But when I was referring to support from birth parents, this is really talking about that grandmother really needing the birth parent to work with her regarding the child's health and well-being. For instance, and I think I might discuss this a little bit later as well, but oftentimes in the research, what I found is that grandparents will talk about conflict. They'll talk about some of the difficulties within that particular family, and they'll say, birth mom changes my plans, or birth mom makes promises that she can't keep. And that really doesn't help my grandchild. So what grandmothers tell me is that when the birth parent is involved, they really need that birth parent to be supportive, to work in conjunction or collaboratively with them, not to make promises that are going to impact and affect that child, but to be there. And that's the support that I was referring to. So grandparents talk about that. If they're going to be around, and it's okay, they have to be supportive. They have to work with me and not against me. Okay? Yes, we're not going to forget birth parents. Birth parents also have strengths and they also have needs as well. Involvement. Well, a lot of you are saying, what? I thought the whole reason why we have kinship families is because the birth parents aren't around. In some situations they aren't. But in a lot of other situations, birth parents are involved. In the study that I conducted looking at 361 grandparents in Los Angeles, I found out that 65% of the birth parents have a level of involvement in that family. Meaning that they were visiting their children. In some situations, they were even helping with child care, making decisions for that particular child, working together with that grandparent to make those decisions. Also, they were maintaining contact over by the phone, so there was a great level of involvement. The current study that I'm working on is just looking at and talking to grandparents, where the birth parents are actively involved in the family. So that still happens. They want to see their children. They want to know what's happening. Also, there's a level of commitment. And I was reminded of this by some Department of Children and Family Services workers that told me, look, you can't talk about the strengths of the birth parent unless you talk about their commitment. Because oftentimes, the placement with that grandparent is temporary. And that birth parent is following that case plan, and they're doing everything possible so that they can get their children returned to them. So they are committed to their children, and they see that happening often, where that parent is really fighting and committed to their child. What do the birth parents need? They need information. They want to know what's happening to their children. And I put an asterisk there because, again, depending on that family situation, if it is a family and there is CPS involvement, perhaps we can't share all of the information depending on those circumstances. But birth parents, they want information. And the grandmothers tell me often, he might not come by to see his child, but he calls. He wants to know what his son is doing or his daughter is doing. They also need visitation. They need some involvement in the lives of their children. And again, the asterisk is there because depending on that circumstances, depending on whether or not there's court involvement and safety issues, visitation may or may not be appropriate. What the research literature shows us is that typically, children in kinship care placements, the birth parents have more visitation. Because, hey, grandmother, that's my son. I'm going to let him in or let her in to visit her child. They have more visitation and are more open to visitation than traditional foster homes. So again, the asterisk is there in terms of those safety issues. Birth parents also need services. You know, we talked about some of the reasons why the children are living with their grandparents currently. So we know they need mental health services or substance abuse services, housing, they need services. And we don't want to forget that and leave them out of the picture on that. They also need to resolve their loss. And that's definitely the loss of their child, the loss of their plans or what they wanted to do in their lives, the loss of being that parent to their particular child. So again, they have loss issues as well. Are there other topics that you can think of, or strengths or needs for birth parents? Yes?
One obstacle sometimes that I've run into is that birth parents, by a variety of reasons, have extremely limited resources. And if we think about the concept of the person, the whole person involving social, emotional, physical, etc. A lot of times, medical and physical neglect on the part of the parents, to some extent, may be contributing towards the personality and behavior that got them in trouble in the first place. But they don't have the resources to get even medical attention. And oftentimes, even if that's identified, it's on the back of the birth parent to come up with the funds and the money to be able to do that, which doesn't, most of the time doesn't happen because they don't have those funds. Is anyone taking a look at that? Or are there any resources for parents that really have medical needs that might help out ultimately with the reunification?
You know what, that's a great question. And in terms of research, is anybody looking at that? I don't think so. We're not necessarily, one of the issues that's out there is that we're not in tune with the birth parent and birth parent involvement in this particular family dynamic. So we're not looking at those issues. So again, that's a major factor. And again, in terms of resources, other than free and reduced rate medical clinics within LA County, I think some of the resources are very limited for parents, for any parent or family that has reduced income and is trying to receive services. I know California has a program, and I can't at this time think of it, but there's like a Cal Health plan for low-income families or families with limited resources. But that is probably the only one that is really existent. Okay, great question, because again, it ties into, if you don't have it and you can't provide for it, it's going to impact you, and it also impacts the health of your children. I think it's called Healthy Families. Is correct? Help me out here. Yeah, Healthy Families. So that's probably one of the major ones that is in existence. Okay, great question. So again, as we look at kinship families, we need to look at 3 key issues regarding their dynamics. We talked about the strengths and needs of each of the individuals involved in that triad, but let's look at the dynamics. The first question that we need to ask and that we really need to assess when we're working with kinship families is, who is in control? I see someone saying the child.
Like the point that this gentleman made about the grandparent losing, I get to spoil the grandchild. I don't see that in a lot of kinship care
placements. I see a lot of, I feel bad for him, I want to give him everything he wants, so they spoil more, and they don't use the same discipline and structure that they would if it was their own child.
Right, so they're getting extra treats as a result, right? It's a good point. So who's in control? Is it the child that's in control of this situation? Is it the birth parent to a certain extent that's in control in kinship families? Are they the ones that are really calling the shots? Is it the grandmother that's in control? Is she the one that is really making the decisions, calling the shots, helping the child, and limiting that influence of that birth parent? Or is it the court and some outside entity? Is it DCFS that's really in control? As you're working with kinship families, that's the first question that you should be asking yourself and trying to assess. Who is in control here? Okay? And as a corollary to that, we also want to think about who is claiming the child. And this is based on the work of Crumley and Little, and also the work of John Grigg that did a lot of studies of kinship family dynamics as well. And they said, who is claiming this child? Is mom still saying, well, mom, you're keeping my baby, this is temporary. She's still my daughter. Or is it a situation where that birth parent isn't claiming the child, and it's really grandmother who's had the child for that child's whole life, and she's the one that's claiming that child? Some of the grandmothers that I work with, they talked about raising multiple children from birth onwards, and that they never knew that she was necessarily grandmother. She claimed that child because the birth parent just was not involved. So it depends on that situation, but we need to ask that question. And lastly, and not to say that this is not the most important question, but at some levels we also need to talk to our children and find out, who does that child claim? And I would say, probably, for every kinship family that you work with, and you talk to a child, you would get a different answer. Because some children really claim their grandmother. My grandmother raised me, I know she's my grandmother, but as far as I'm concerned, she is mama. Who does that child claim? Who is that child's allegiance to? Other children will say, hey, grandma is grandmother. I have a mom, and someday my mom is going to get her life together and we will be a family again. So as we're looking at and working with kinship families, we need to look at those dynamics. And in some cases, we need to work with the parties involved to help them answer these questions. We need to work with those families involved to help them answer those questions. Because as we're going to talk about in a few minutes, when these questions go unanswered, and we're not sure of who the child claims and who's in control and what's going on, we can have some situations. Okay? And that leads me to our next topic, which is conflicted families and conflict that can result in kinship families. So, I want to talk about conflicted families. You know, conflicted families are those kinship families that just have a high level of tension and conflict and distress for whatever reason, okay? And that does happen. And in the work of Grief and some other people that did research on this, O'Brien as well, they looked at two types of conflict in kinship families. And the first one is oscillating. Oscillating families, oscillating conflicted kinship families, are those families that are usually informal kinship care families. They're really not sure of who's in control, okay? There are also some ambivalence in these particular families in terms of who's in charge and what's going on, who's in control. Maybe mom comes around and she's doing well, and mom is now in control. And then when mom disappears, oh wow, there's some more conflict because now grandmother has to be back in control. So these are oscillating families. A lot of conflict and tension around those issues of who is in control. On the other hand, O'Brien talks about distressed families. And these are families in which initially there wasn't any conflict. Every member of that triad worked together and they were able to work with each other. However, disagreements and other issues led to those grandparents choosing to exclude the birth parents from the family. So perhaps there was issues of who claimed the child. And the birth parents said, I'm claiming the child, and the grandmother said, no, I'm claiming the child. So what I will do, I'll just leave you, birth parent, out of the picture. And so there's a lot of tension and disagreements regarding those issues. Yes?
I've also seen tension with parents as far as parental issues. Maybe mom parents one way and grandmother parents a different way. And I've seen conflict in that as well.
Big issue. We're going to talk about some of the issues and reasons for conflict. But how you raise my child. I had so many, part of the study that I did with the 361 parents included interviews with the grandmothers. And they gave so many reports of issues regarding parenting styles. And the fact that, hey, the way the grandmother parented 30 years ago is not working now. The birth mother had her own ideas, and that set up some issues of conflict. But let's look at other reasons. Power struggles, parenting. How are you doing? How are you parenting my child? Who's in control? Who's in charge? The grandmother saying, look, you can't visit now because I don't want you in my home. This whole notion of power. Understand that the birth parent has lost their child. That grandparent has gained a child. So there's a power struggle in and of itself. Who is in charge? Who is in control? Another major reason for conflicts in kinship families comes from this notion of visitation. And who has custody? And basically there have been a lot of studies that have looked at that. The number one reason for conflict deals with visitation. Even when there is the court involvement, and the court is saying when the birth parent can visit and how often, there still may be conflict. We oftentimes think it's best to have court involvement and the court is going to handle it and make the situation better, but no, there's still a lot of issues regarding the conflicts regarding custody and visitation. The birth mother wants her child back. Grandparent is saying, no, you're not ready. I don't think you should. So those issues of custody and visitation often lead to conflict. And this is interesting. Previous history. I wasn't looking for this when I went into the study. I just felt like, oh, it would be issues of custody and visitation and issues regarding power that would be causes of conflict. And what I found out, and it was also supported by another study that occurred in 1999, is that often in kinship families, when there is a lot of conflict, the conflict started prior to the child being placed in the home. And I was just surprised. So there was this ongoing kind of issue between this particular birth parent and this grandmother, and it just carried into that child's placement, unfortunately. And I just want to share with you one of the quotes from one of the grandmothers in my study. She's 64 years old, and she said, you know, everything is difficult. We have never got along from the day she was born. We just can't talk about anything without an argument. So that conflict didn't start because of the child necessarily being in the home. It was there prior to that placement. And as we're working with kinship families and we're assessing those placements, we also need to look at that dynamic between that birth parent and that grandparent. Is it a conflicted relationship already, Or is it a relationship that is built on support? Because that was one of the issues. And I was like, wow, I was blown away when I read that. And that was just one quote. I have several others that kind of talk about that. I don't want you to think that all kinship families have conflicted dynamics or live in conflict. There are some very supportive and cooperative kinship families where they're all working together. And for us to have these types of outcomes, literature and research suggests that for kinship families to be more cooperative, authority needs to be clarified. It goes back to who is in control. If we can get all the parties together, that grandmother and that birth mother, and talk about who's really going to be in control. Is this going to be temporary? How long do you think this may go on? If we're able to do that, get that information to them. That's so critical, because it's sad to me when I go out and talk to grandparents and they say, they didn't know that. It's a lot of services that they can access for themselves and also for their child. The other piece is long-term planning. Just like we need to have a long-term plan, and I don't have one, which is shame on me, but we need to have a long-term plan for ourselves. Grandparents also need to have a long-term plan. Who's going to be available should something happen to that grandparent? Who else in the family can step up to the plate if something happens to that particular caregiver? And so oftentimes, we're in a society, we don't want to think about tomorrow. We don't want to do that type of planning. But when we can, and we can engage that family, usually at the very beginning of these types of placement situations, that's really good. Because when the crisis happens, and sometimes in families, crises do happen, we've already got that plan in place. And we started it early enough that birth mother understands what the plan is, that the other children that are in that family understand what the plan is, that the grandmother understands what the plan is, and she understands that she can change it at time. Okay? And there are actually resources available, and I'll talk to you about one, that will help grandparents do that planning legally so that they have everything that that child will need in the future. And lastly, and you all know this in this room, but just as a reminder, as much as possible, we want to use culturally specific and community-based services. Okay? Grandmothers like their communities. They're often fixtures within that community. So they want to go where they're close, where they're comfortable. We want to make sure that services provide linguistic support for those grandparents as well. And the great thing nowadays, especially in LA County, because kinship families are so prominent, we have so many services that are available, both in the secular world, and we also have faith-based church services that are providing services and support to kinship families. It passed legislation, and there's currently a national or federal piece of legislation regarding kinship families that is going to a vote. So if you want that kind of information, please make sure that you review that particular website. And the Urban Institute, if